You're listening to the Ugly Truth Podcast with George and Christina Markoski, your weekly injection of science, insights, and myth-busting. For awesome info and trending content, go to theuglytruth.blog.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Ugly Truth Podcast. We're going to be talking about something that could actually be making history in Australia right now. In 2017, we have got a postal vote that's going out about gay marriage, whether people should have it or whether people shouldn't. So that's what we're going to be discussing today.
So we've just had the postal vote go out, and you can say yes or no. So we've got Johnnie Cass here, and before we get into the questions, I just want to talk to you about your experience. So you were actually the first gay male in Australia to, I guess, go on a reality TV show and be openly gay. So what was that like for you?
Well, hey, Christina, great to be on the show. Thank you very much for having me.
You're welcome.
Yeah, thank you. It was a long time ago, so let's just be really clear about that. It was 2001 that I was on the very first Australian Big Brother in Australia. And I guess one of the things that made me an interesting character on that show was that, yes, I was the first openly gay man on Australian television at that time, which in itself was quite controversial, which is kind of almost like, if you look now, we're in 2017 and, we see gays and lesbians and transgenders on television all the time. Personally, how was that experience for me? In many ways, it was quite daunting. I never really deliberately went on that show to be a gay role model as such. I just went on there because I just wanted to experience something. I happened to go through the auditions and made it through and thought, well, let's just give it a go. But yes, I did happen to be an Australian gay role model at that time. And to be really honest with you, there were some people that thought that I was really fabulous on that show. And then there were some people who thought I was a complete douchebag on that show. And that came from both the straights and from the gay people as well. So there were some people who said that I had set the gay agenda back 10 years. So You're
joking. I can't imagine why people would say that, though, when you're the one who's sort of, I guess, raising awareness in an inadvertent way, just by being yourself and being on national television. So I don't know why people would think you're setting the gay agenda back 10 years. Could you elaborate on that at all? Like, what was their reason behind saying that?
Well, it's a great question to ask. And I think, because at that time, I don't know, look, I think because at that time I was, I'm a pretty straight gay guy, even if that makes sense. Like, I'm not... I understand I'm not overly flamboyant. So I think because I was kind of almost playing a straight gay guy, I think some people didn't really like that. That's the bottom line. And also, I think at that point in time, HIV and AIDS was very much in the media, and I wasn't really overly up to date with what was happening in regards to that as well. So things get taken out of context. I mean, that's really the only thing that I can think of as to why anybody would have thought that I was doing a lousy job as a homosexual on television.
Right, interesting. You got called out on your, sexuality and everything like that, like your sexual preferences, and people were judging you for that in a way.
Correct.
So,
and I mean, look, I also got, a lot of really great comments from people. Like, when I left that show, I had literally thousands and thousands of emails, and I still keep those emails, either from families that for the very first time in a long time picked up the phone and called their son or called their daughter because they just saw that I was a normal person and reconciled differences. Or I had young teenagers emailing me and telling me that they were contemplating suicide and were really happy to see a role model on television television, or again, a teenager that was able to have a conversation with their parents about their sexuality. So for me, they're the things that I hold on to. And like I said, I still keep those emails because I look back and I have to say they were probably some of my proudest moments in doing that show.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's great that you've had a positive impact on that community. And I think we've certainly come a long way since 2001. They've basically got the LGBT community that is a thing now. I don't believe it was a thing back in 2001.
Yeah.
And I think just the way people have become more educated and the way they've learned more about things, a lot more people are open-minded these days.
Yes. Well, you'd like to think so. And in many ways, you are 100% right. Like there is, I saw a friend posting on Facebook the other day that in the streets of Nowra, they were had rainbow flags down there, and that Nowra Council Chamber was in support of, yes, marriage equality. And, we're having obviously this debate across the country right now. So yes, in many ways, there has been a massive amount of progress and a massive amount of media exposure.
Yeah.
And yet in some ways, the fact that we're even having a discussion about my sexuality, about the sexuality of the LGBTQI community, and debating that also says that we haven't come a long way.
Now, I noticed I call it the LGBT community. What's the QI? What is that? That must be quite recently new.
Yeah,
what's that one?
Look, even I'm not au fait with all the different letters at the end. I think the Q...
It's like it's changing daily. It's going to be like every letter of the alphabet soon.
Exactly. I think the Q stands for queer and the I stands for intersex. And intersex is somebody who I believe... doesn't correlate to one sexual preference or another. So, again, you'll have to excuse my ignorance around that, but that's what I believe it is.
Right, yeah. It's interesting to see that whole thing sort of evolve, because originally it would have been just known as gay people, and then it's sort of just expanded from there because...
Correct.
There's so many more different variations these days. And in a way, do you think that's why we're getting, I guess, what you could call such a strong right-wing uproar about everything?
I think, there's always going to be polar sides to any debate. And, progress and change, people don't like it. And change is inevitable. It's going to happen. It's how society evolves. And progress requires conscious thought and conscious decision. So to sort of just block everybody as gay is kind of really then doesn't give a voice to somebody who identifies as potentially bisexual, or then somebody who identifies as transgender. So as society, I believe, expands and grows, you'll see more minorities wanting to be heard.
So it's just a way of, I guess, recognizing them by sort of labeling them?
Yeah, pretty much, for sure. And if you want to use, I don't even like to use, the word right wing or left wing, but people with a different opinion, they just don't want to embrace that change, and they don't want to recognize fundamentally that there are people who are different to some sort of homogenized idea of what society should be.
Right, yeah. No, I understand that, absolutely. So the gay marriage postal vote, a lot of people were saying, it was $122 million to actually send out this postal vote to have people do it. What are your thoughts on that? A lot of people are saying, it's a massive waste of money, and surely, for the fraction of a price, we could have done like an online survey. So what are your thoughts on the whole postal vote?
Yeah, look, my thoughts on the whole postal vote, the whole postal survey, To be really honest with you, I think the only way I could really describe it is mixed. Like that, I would have to say I definitely have mixed feelings about it, and I guess that's being polite. If I was to not be polite about it,
just let loose.
Yeah, to let loose, I would actually think. I would, on a moral level and on an ethical level, I would call it quite disgusting. I would call it a waste of the Australian taxpayer's dollar. And I think the fact that I remember when I got my postal survey, I stood in shock thinking that here I am being asked to have equal rights as a minority within the Australian wider community. Like, that's just disgusting. It's like, why do I even have to ultimately be begging and pleading to be considered an equal Australian based on my sexual orientation, when at the end of the day, the politicians and the government should have done their job, which was just to have passed it through Parliament, just like John Howard did in 2004, when he changed the definition of marriage to be between a man and a woman. There was no plebiscite that had to happen for it then. And also the actual High Court in 2013 again redefined that the constitution of marriage can be between same-sex couples. So why do we have to have a survey to justify my equality?
Was that actually in Australia that happened? Yeah, obviously it was, if John Howard was the one doing it.
I'm pretty sure that, in 2013, the High Court found that marriage in the Constitution includes marriage between persons of the same sex, and that under the Constitution and federal law, as it now stands, whether same-sex marriage should be provided for by law is a matter of the federal parliament. So the answer is yes.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah.
So
that
from a legal standpoint,
yeah,
technically you can already get married?
No, they just made it clear that the federal government had the power to enact marriage equality. So just like they had the power to constitute it between a man and a woman, the High Court says it can be between same sex. So therefore, Parliament, if they want to, they can pass it through legislation.
I understand.
But in essence, because the politicians don't want to make a stand, because Malcolm Turnbull basically took over Tony Abbott, and I'm pretty sure that when he usurped Tony Abbott, a behind-the-door, closed-door deal was made that he wasn't going to push the gay marriage equality issue through Parliament. So in essence, Malcolm Turnbull said, yes, I'm going to be the Prime Minister, but I'm not going to make this decision on behalf of the people.
Yeah. Well, that actually brings me to my whole take on the postal vote.
Yeah.
So at first there was obviously the massive outroar about, the $22 million, like, it's such a waste of money and everything.
122
and Facebook
million.
was just blowing up.
Yeah.
And we had everyone going nuts about what a big waste of money this is. So I thought, hang on a second, why is it actually happening? Like, let's look a little deeper into the reasons why it's a postal vote, for one. And I guess the issue at hand is quite sensitive. So from a political standpoint, I actually think Malcolm Turnbull is quite smart. I know a lot of people would disagree with me, but when it comes to this issue, the way he's handled it, he's basically done it in a way where he's essentially passed the buck and given everyone a chance to have their say, which is giving more democracy to the people. So I think it's a good thing that it was a postal vote. And he's done that so that, let's say, for example, a majority yes vote comes back, then he can put it through and pass it as a yes, and say it was due to the overwhelming response from the surveys.
Sure.
And the same could happen if it were a no.
Sure.
So he's done it so that he is going to look like the good guy no matter what the outcome, basically.
Well, and again, this is, Christina, why when you asked me the question initially, why do I have mixed feelings about it? Because on one level, you are absolutely right, and every Australian should definitely have a say about a subject that is very personal for a lot of people. So I appreciate that. However, one needs to remember as well that Parliament are representatives of the people. And there have been many, many polls leading up to this which have proved over and over again that the majority of Australians were for marriage equality. Now, true leadership should have the Parliament represents the people. Why do we need another postal survey, which is also non-binding? And at the end of the day, if they don't want to pass it through, they don't have to pass it through either. So it's really just, in theory, confirming what we've already known anyway, but yet at the same time digging up a whole bunch of rhetoric and vilification from both sides as to why we should have either gay marriage or against gay marriage. So great leadership should have made the decision. I mean, in 2004, when John Howard changed the definition of marriage, why was there no conversation around it then? Why did we have to have a plebiscite now when John Howard just decided to pass it through back then to change the definition of it? So it's actually a political question, not a religious question either.
This is true. These are some really good points. And this brings me to another reason why Malcolm Turnbull's actually used a postal vote. Basically, I was thinking, what could be some more reasons behind why it's been done this way? So when you think about the sort of people that are going to be saying no, what generations do you think they would belong to?
Look, I don't really like to... if we're going to make generalizations like that, I think that's a very interesting question. I think if you look at some of the research, obviously, I think it's the younger generations that are pushing for yes. But I also know older generations that are pushing for yes. I don't necessarily think it's more about generations, but more about moral and ethical values that people are trying to hold on to that are voting no.
Absolutely, but there's no denying that the older generations are more conservative, therefore they're more likely to be voting no. I think that's why it was a postal vote, so that obviously everyone could be included.
Now, but you need to remember as well, it's also not a compulsory postal vote. And we've also, if you look on Facebook, you'll also see images of postal surveys that have been left out in the streets, found in the trash cans. I think we also saw posts of people who were willing to sell their surveys for a certain amount of money. So then one could also begin to ask, what's the validity of the actual postal survey within itself? This is fundamentally a human rights issue, and in putting a human rights issue to have a minority be judged by a majority, you've got to really question that. It's no different to going back to should women have the right to vote? And it's no different to should white people be able to marry black people, and should black people be able to have the rights as white people. Like it's no different to that progress and the uproar that we saw happening in those different times as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Just going back quickly to how you mentioned how it's not compulsory. That's a great point. But people who do want to say can have their say.
Correct.
And obviously you can choose to do nothing.
Correct.
And people who do care about the issue are going to vote. There's no doubt about that.
Absolutely.
If you're a strong yes or a strong no, you're going to put in the effort to do that postal vote.
Absolutely.
For sure.
Yeah.
So I do think it was even though obviously there's a lot of issues around it, I can't see a better way that it could have been done, to be honest.
Okay, and what's your thinking behind that?
I'm just thinking from a democracy point of view and also a political standpoint. The way Malcolm Turnbull has done this has been very democratic for the people. You know, he's given everyone the chance to have their say.
Yep. So my question to you then is, at what point do we draw the line when different legislations are going through Parliament, where Parliament makes the decisions as a representative of the people, as opposed to Parliament not doing their job and saying, well, we now need to put this to a plebiscite? So the only other times that we've ever had a plebiscite, I think, was when we were going to for conscription to go into World War I, and whether we should have a national anthem. So, for example, if we wanted to change a piece of legislation in Parliament, do we now have to have plebiscites for everything, or should politicians just do their jobs representing people?
Look, honestly, I think it would be good if people had more of a say. I think Australia could become a better place.
Sure. And we need to also remember that Australians also have a say in the way that they ultimately vote. So people will either vote for Liberals again in the way that they dealt with this plebiscite, or they will go to Labor or another party because of their support for marriage equality. So eventually the people will vote when it comes to election time.
Yes, that is a good point. But if we could, I guess, get more power by voting on specific issues, wouldn't that be even better?
Sure. So do we want to spend now another $120 million and bring up like different opinions all the time in the name of democracy? Or do we elect politicians who are going to do jobs for us based on but basically getting politicians to do their job, which is to lead the country based on our needs and requirements?
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. Obviously, you've got to draw the line somewhere.
Totally.
And I think really it would depend on the issue at hand. And, I honestly, don't know what would be a good example of something else that I would like to vote on, maybe taxes, what our taxes should go towards. Can we have a yes or no vote for that?
Great. So again, pause. So I appreciate what you're saying. And yes, what happens is when a party comes up for election, what do? They put forward their promises about what they're going to do during that election period.
But they don't do it. They
Correct.
never do what they say they're going to do. They should be held accountable by the people.
100% agree. We know that generally speaking, politicians lie, they twist things around, they make a whole bunch of promises. We've seen that happen in America, we see it happen here. And again, come the next election period, when all those empty promises are brought to the surface, we vote with our feet by either keeping that party or by finding another party to vote for. So again, ultimately, this government made the decision not to pass through same-sex marriage in Parliament and go to a plebiscite, which means that when it comes to election time, we as the voters will decide whether or not we want Malcolm Turnbull and the Liberals back in place from a leadership point of view, or did he do a lousy job in leadership in passing the buck? And I think we'll see that he's probably not going to win by that much, if he is going to win at all. Because
it's going to be very interesting to obviously see the outcome of this survey and see, if it's had the desired outcome, I guess. That's the only way we're really going to know whether it's worked or not.
Correct.
And,
Correct.
We're going to have to stay tuned for that one.
Because great leadership would have realised that, bringing up a plebiscite, yes, or one could argue my point. Great leadership would have realised that bringing up a plebiscite and leaving it to us to make a decision was going to bring up vitriol, hate speech, bigotry, a whole bunch of things from both sides, And is that really what Australians are about? And is that really what Australian leadership is about at the end of the day? Are some of the broader questions I think we need to be asking ourselves.
Absolutely. However, on that point, I do think everyone is entitled to say yes or no. And despite, the social media backlash or everything like that surrounds it, I think democracy is very important for the people. And if you want to say no, you should have the right to say no. Just like if you say yes, you should have the right to say yes.
Yeah.
So
absolutely.
I think leaving it up to the politicians sometimes, they might have, their own agenda. I could say that for Tony Abbott. I know he's religious, so I could guarantee you what his outcome would be on the matter.
Sure.
So I think giving the people more of a voice is very important. So I'm going to have to disagree with you on that point about, it not being a good idea. I've thought about it so much, and I can't see any other way where we're letting people have their say, letting all people, because obviously there's older generations as well that might not be able to use a computer to vote. So I think the postal vote was the best way to do it.
Yeah. Look, again, Christina, as I said to you at the very beginning, I have very mixed reactions about the whole conversation. I mean, I'm also not a politician, and one needs to ask themselves, why is it that Australia is the last English-speaking country, modern country on the face of the earth that still hasn't legalised same-sex marriage? And why is it that Australia, I believe, was the only country that had to do it to a plebiscite? So there was a whole, whether it be Ireland, one of the most conservative countries on the earth, you're talking about England, you're talking about Chile, you're talking about a whole other bunch of countries that didn't have to go through the process of a plebiscite and left it up to their politicians to do their job. Why couldn't the Australian Parliament do their job is the only question that I'm asking here. 100% agree with you. It's great that the people have a voice, and I think all that we're going to find, and I hope all that we're going to find, is that at the end of the day, the postal survey is just going to validate what all the polls said anyway, that the majority of Australians support same-sex marriage, but we've had to drudge up all this hate speech and bigotry and getting a minority to plead with the majority in order to get there.
Yeah, I completely understand. Look, the only logical reason I can think that Australia, it's taken us obviously so long to get to this point in time, the only good answer I would have for that is the fact that we have a lot of conservatives in Australia. And
we do have a lot of conservatives, and I think they're in itself one, for me personally, I find that quite interesting. I would have thought and would have hoped that as a nation we would have been more progressive, we would have been more open, and we would have been more accepting of diversity. But unfortunately, what we see is a lot of racism, a lot of bigotry, a lot of hate speech, and we see it on both sides. I'm by no means, having a go at the no campaign, and I want to be really clear, everybody has the right to say no. It's just how do we go about it? Like how hurtful would it be to you as a woman, for example, to walk down the street and see a sign that basically says women are second class, shouldn't have a voice and don't have an opinion and are basically there to serve their husbands? Like if there was a survey that was conducted on that, how would you feel about that, to read that, to see that you were considered a second-class citizen just because of the way that you were born?
Yeah, absolutely. Honestly, that would not be a good situation at all. And I think it just comes down to a lack of empathy and education on some parts, People are raised with their values and beliefs, and, the way they're going to vote is essentially based on that.
Correct. And values and beliefs, not only for individuals, but also for nations, shift and change. And really that in essence is what's happening here, is we're seeing a cultural shift in values of this nation. And like I said to you before, change is inevitable. Progress requires conscious thought, conscious decision. And to some degree, the great thing about this plebiscite is that it has caused people who might have been in the past somewhat sitting on the fence or ambivalent or not really having an opinion, putting stake in the ground and stand for something that they believe in. And that in itself is probably a good thing.
Absolutely, I agree. Get off the fence.
Right,
Either no or yes.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so some of the reasons people might be saying no, the first one I want to talk about is people saying, children need a mother and a father. So if gay marriage is legalised, gay couples will be able to have children and raise them. So what are your thoughts on that argument?
I mean, okay, so the question is, do children need a mother and a father in order to raise happy, healthy children? Is that really in essence the question?
No, the question is gay people will be able to have and raise children.
Great.
So
and
that might come of gay marriage being legalised.
And how,
so it's more of a statement than a question.
Sure. And how is that a problem? How is it a problem that a loving couple, whether they be same sex or of different sex, have children? The only thing that children need is love, support, nurturing and guidance to be raised healthy, happy and somewhat functional. Now we could look at countless, in fact, it's what I talk about. You could look at countless amounts of dysfunctional families that have a male and a father and a female role model. And let's be really frank, they haven't done a great job at parenting, and it has nothing to do with their sexual preferences. It's really, the real question is, can this couple be a great parent? And if there's going to be a mother and a father influence, well, then that's great as well. And if there's not, then that's also great as well. The only question is, are we raising happy, healthy children? And chances are, if we've had to fight for our love and we've had to fight for our relationship, then you're going to get a pretty healthy, happy relationship. Now, that's not to say that within any gay relationship, there's also not certain dysfunctionalities. That's just life. That's human nature. That's not an issue of sexual preference. That's an issue of parenting.
Okay. So people saying, but you need a mother and a father figure because obviously they're both different sexes. So, for example, say you've got like a daughter who needs a mother because, growing up she needs to learn about things from her mother. And then you could say the same about somebody who's got a son, they need a father figure to teach them how to be a man, I guess.
Okay, so Christina, what would you like to say right now to all the single mothers out there that for whatever reason don't have a father figure in their relationship? Whether that be through divorce, whether that be through the father that died or the father that left or vice versa. Like, should we now say that single mothers or single fathers are incapable of raising children?
That's a really good point. And I tend to agree with you on that one. There are plenty of single parents out there, single fathers and single mothers doing great jobs.
Correct.
So wouldn't obviously having two loving parents be just as good as the one?
Sure. I mean, in an ideal world, we would have happy mum, happy dad, and happy children raised. But you and I know that that's just theory. And there's many, and this is probably really my biggest beef with people who, from religious backgrounds, who have never been married, never been in a relationship, never understand the challenges of modern life, stand up on a pulpit and espouse what would be the perfect family unit. We don't live in a utopian society like that. We have many personal, emotional challenges, financial challenges, challenges to navigate through life. We're not talking about a Walt Disney movie here. There's such a broad spectrum that whole conversation in my mind is completely null and void. What about a child that was brought up in an orphanage or a child that was brought up in foster care? Are we saying that that child is any less valuable than a child that's brought up with a mum and dad in a typical family unit? No.
No, not at all, yeah. Also, a point I want to make about this argument, so gay couples actually already do have and raise children. They've got access to, obviously, IVF and adoption and even foster care.
Correct.
So the fact that they're already doing it, I guess the issue's only sort of been brought to light because of the vote.
Correct, and it's a totally, in many ways, a distraction from the core question, which is, should same-sex couples be able to marry? The question is not, should same-sex couples be able to marry and have children? That is a totally separate question. And as you rightly say, Christina, it's already happening whether you like it or not. And like I said, some parents are doing a great job, some parents are not doing such a great job, and that's a totally separate issue. It's going to happen. It's already happening.
I tend to agree. That's not the question that's being asked. So in a way, I guess a lot of people are obviously thinking, you know, what leads on from marriage? Usually kids. So maybe that's where their concern has sort of linked up to the whole marriage question.
Sure. So, I mean, it's just we're creating a problem about a problem that lies in the future. Let's just deal, and I get we need to be a little bit forward thinking and things like that, but, you know, it's no different to me. If we really want to clutch at such straws like this, I mean, I could throw out the agenda that says, do you know what? Religion or these conservatives who are so concerned about children, like maybe they should look within certain religious organizations where we've seen massive amounts of cover-ups in regards to child sex abuse or massive amounts of abuse reported within the Catholic Church.
You're opening a can of worms.
I know, but I know that. But if we're really concerned about the children, let's look at home before we start pointing fingers, because it's too sensitive. But we can pick on the gays and we can pick on something that's in the media, but we don't want to talk about what's really happening behind closed doors. Yeah, I am opening up a can of worms because people don't like to look at that can of worms.
It's an ugly can of worms.
Exactly. It's an ugly can of worms, but let's pick on the minority to maybe avoid looking at our own internal issues if you really want to be realistic about it. A quick Google search on number of child abuse within the Catholic religion will tell you that there's way too many to even report. Now, again, I'm not having a dig at Catholicism, I'm not having a dig at religion. I'm just saying, if we want to start moving away from the subject at hand, where does the line end?
And it's in a way good to obviously raise awareness of these sort of things that have happened in the past, so people know.
Totally. And Christina, they're still happening. It's not just in the past, it's still happening.
Yeah. Oh, it's
a big topic. It's a really big topic.
It's a massive topic that we could get into.
The interesting thing, though, Christina, is, you know, I mean, again, we're going to have another digression on the topic. You know, what has been found to happen in other societies where gay marriage has been passed? Well, pretty much nothing. Everyone wakes up the next day. Every straight person's marriage is still valid. Their life continues. The only difference is that those who are feeling somewhat oppressed and a minority can actually have a deeper sense of pride and a deeper sense of belonging. Some might argue that and say that, you know, freedom of speech has been removed in some of those countries, etc., but we're already seeing freedom of speech coming from the no voters at the moment right now. And, that's a whole nother subject within itself.
Yeah, absolutely. I think both sides of the argument seem to be voicing their opinions quite loudly on social media.
Yes.
I can't say, no people have been worse than yes, or yes, people have been worse than no people. I can see a very consistent amount of people from both sides.
Yeah. Look, I agree. I sometimes think, you'll see certain people saying the hypocrisy of the yes voters. You have to understand, though, as well, like, to be judged and to be oppressed for your entire life and work through those deep-seated issues of I'm not good enough, of shame, I'm a second-class citizen, to work through all those issues and then get to a stage in your life and have that questioned again, you can't help but be a little bit impassioned by that and a little bit like, well, who the fuck do you think you are to judge me? Like, there's a little element of that going on for sure. Do we want to have a civil debate? Absolutely, but when you look at an image of somebody who writes on a train, faggots die, or all faggots go to hell, or, I'm posting a comment on somebody's page and then they put a picture up that says AIDS alert. It's like,
oh, wow.
This is you're just being stupid. You're not opening to an intelligent debate and discussion. You're just looking for a platform to voice your hate, your bigotry, and your anger. So, of course, emotions are arisen.
Absolutely, and I think it's stirring up emotions for a lot of people on both sides.
Totally.
So, next is, so if gay marriage is passed, there's going to be radical sexual education taught in schools. So kids in Year 7 are already being asked to role play a same-sex relationship. What are your thoughts on this?
Okay, look, I completely appreciate and I completely understand a parent's need to protect their children, 100%. So is it actually a fact that children are being asked to role play same-sex relationships in school? Do we know that that's actually happening?
I actually, to be honest, I don't know if it's a real fact.
Yeah.
This is what I've heard as an argument.
Okay, cool. So totally get it. So we have to appreciate that a child's sexual evolution is inevitable. At some point in time, children are going to explore sexuality, children are going to explore their sexuality, children are going to ask questions about sexuality. Children don't have issues with sexuality. Parents have issues with sexuality that gets projected onto a child. So if a parent has an issue with a child role-playing same-sex relationship and says that's disgusting, that shouldn't be taught in school, well, the child learns that from the parent. Whereas if the parent says, oh, okay, well, there are some relationships where maybe boys are attracted to boys and girls are attracted to boys and not everybody fits into the spectrum of normal. Whatever you, my son or my daughter, innately feel is right for you, you need to go with that and I will love and accept you for who you are. At the end of the day, sex needs to be discussed. But we don't discuss it, and as a result of that, there's shame, there's stigma around it, and we have a lot of issues around sexuality. Parents should, at the end of the day, be educating their children around sex within their homes and not just be leaving it up to teachers. But the problem is that you get parents who are just going to call it disgusting and be naive and stupid about it rather than being smart about it and going, well, it is what it is, and move on. We're the ones that make a big deal out of it.
Everyone listening, thank you. Once
Interesting.
Again, stay well.
Would you say it's okay then
For awesome info and trending content, go to
kids in Year 7 to be
theuglytruth.com.
role-playing a same-sex marriage?
Yeah, I would actually, because it's role play, it's not real, and it's important for children to be discussing sex. And let's face it, by Year 7, kids will be exposed to sex and they're either going to be exposed to pornography or they're going to be exposed to some form of sexual content. I mean, you look at video clips these days, music video clips, and they're overly sexualized. So it requires a simple, healthy discussion. It's not just taking it out of context and saying, well, they're being asked to role play same-sex relationships. What's the conversation that goes around that? What's the context that goes around that? And having an intelligent discussion with your children around what that means for them. That doesn't mean that that's what they have to do. It's just that that's what some other people do. You do what's important to you.
Do you think that a child would have the right to refuse to participate in that sort of activity?
Yeah, I think so, for sure.
So a teacher says, next we're going to role play same-sex marriage. You've got to kiss this guy and you're a guy. Do you think the student could say, no, I'm not participating in that?
I think the child should have the option to say, no, I'm not participating in that. And so, yes, now this is where we potentially start getting into some of the challenges that may arise with that. But let's deal with that when that situation occurs.
I think it comes down to the school and their curriculum, because same-sex marriage has nothing to do with what is taught in specific schools. Certain schools choose their educational agenda and then they do what they want from there. So it's the individual school. So as a parent, I think it's your responsibility to make sure you know what school is teaching your children, and you've got the right to that. And if you don't agree with it, then you can make your mind up whether, you want to send them to that school, whether it's actually the right school for them.
Correct. I mean, I wish I had given that answer, to be honest with you, Christina, because ultimately that's right. If the parents don't like what's being taught in the school, then take the kids out of the school. It's, again, I saw on Facebook just recently a mother posting a post of kids that were at a school that were basically boys were asked to dress as girls and girls were asked to dress as boys. And, there was like, oh my God, there's a whole transgender agenda that's being pushed through. It's the work of the devil. Okay, so what about at Halloween? Do we now not get our children to dress up as witches or get them to dress up as ghosts because they're affiliated with Satanism and they're affiliated with the devil? Like, where do we draw the line? Again, it comes down to the parent. Like, Christina, as a woman, wouldn't you like maybe one day for a boy to know what it feels like to be a girl just for one day, or a girl to be in the shoes of a boy from the sake of empathy? It's all about the meaning that the adults create for the children, because the children don't have any meaning. A child looks to a parent for meaning. And if the parent makes it mean that it's yucky and dirty and disgusting, well, that says something more about the parent than it does the child. Or is it just playtime and fun time and we're just exploring and creating little Johnny? That's all that we're doing. Nobody's asking you to dress up as a girl again, but that's what girls feel like sometimes. Now you can go back to being a boy tomorrow, no big deal.
Right. So it actually happened in a school in Australia where they had, was it a specific day where they said the boys can come as girls and the girls can come as boys?
I believe it was, yes. It was a
specific
day. I think it was a school, I'm not 100% sure, in Byron Bay.
Yeah. Wow.
But again, the parents who go to that school probably were okay with it. It was probably somebody who took it out of context and has made it into something bigger. And then the irony of it was they then posted a picture, like I said, that said, be vigilant because Satan's work is, to become, for the population to become transgender. And I was like, okay, let's just think about this for a minute. There's 7 billion people currently on the face of the earth. If you do a Google search, you'll see that there's approximately 20 million transgender people on the face of the earth. As a percentage, that's 0.03% of the population are currently transgender. Like, hang on a minute. Like, really? Is that the agenda of the devil? Because by the time we become all transgender, we're all going to be dead anyway. It's just ridiculous, ludicrous pushing of just silliness.
Yeah. Yeah, well, obviously the LGBTQI, did I get that right?
You did, well done.
Is a minority, which is an issue, and we don't want any segregation when it comes to minorities. But just going back to the issue of the school, I want to talk about that a little bit more. So you referred to it being no different to people dressing up on Halloween. I tend to disagree with that point you made because, you know, it's one thing to dress up for Halloween, which is a holiday that you dress up for, and it's another thing to actually be told to come to school as the opposite sex.
Yeah. So
I personally don't think school is the time or place to push anyone's sexual agenda at all. I don't think, you know, I think what that school did was wrong, to be honest. I get that, you know, that you might think they're trying to raise awareness, but kids are very young and impressionable. Sure. And we don't have kids making the decision whether or not they're going to transition. Sure. You have teenagers, you know, considering it, but it's usually not until they're actually 18 or older that they actually go through with the permanent surgeries and things like that. So I think children are going to change their minds as well on issues. So I don't think it's very productive of the school to do things like that, and I can understand why a lot of people were upset about it, honestly.
Absolutely. So again, this is, you know, I'm going to come back to the conversation that we had at the very beginning. There is a lot of mixed emotions wrapped up in all of this. And if you now think about it, we've now moved from the original question, which was, should same-sex couples be able to marry? And we're now having a debate about whether or not what they did in that school was right or wrong. And it's almost worth having an entirely different podcast in itself.
Absolutely. This issue, you know, it can sort of snowball into other things. So let's bring it back a notch.
Let's bring it back.
And get on to the next argument. These arguments are going to sort of digress a bit, but these are genuine. These are the main genuine arguments that people have for voting no, so that's why we're discussing them today. Yeah. So the next one is, traditionally marriage has been between a man and a woman, therefore it should remain so. That's the way God made it. Thoughts?
Okay, so this is a more of a moral question and an ethical question, and I think we've already seen that John Howard changed the definition of marriage in 2004. Define a traditional marriage for me. So a traditional marriage has undergone many evolutions. So once upon a time, a traditional marriage, I think in 1942, a traditional marriage, you could marry a girl as young as 12 years old. So should we bring that back in as an element of traditional marriage, that should you have a daughter, Christina, that we can allow that 12-year-old daughter to still be married? A traditional marriage in this country once upon a time said that the native indigenous culture could not marry a white person, a white man. There was a case around that. So is that the definition of a traditional marriage? Do we now want to go back to only whites can marry whites and only blacks can marry blacks? Like that? Define tradition for me.
Yeah, where do we draw the line when it comes to what people think is traditional? That's a really good point.
And you know, and you can say, well, in the Bible it says marriage is between a man and a woman, and I'm not really up on the Bible 100%, but I don't even know if it does say that in the Bible. But the Bible also says a hell of a lot of other things as well. One of the things that the Bible does say, for example, is love thy neighbor. So right now in this debate, are we loving our neighbours? And the Bible also says that, you know, if you divorce or you remarry, it's considered adultery. So what do we say to all those people who committed adultery? In fact, the Bible also says so much as even if you look at another person, you have committed adultery. So when you talk about traditional values and you talk about tradition, like we really, where do we draw the line? Because again, traditionally, women were basically taught that they were inferior in traditional marriages. So do we want to go back to those sort of times?
And I digress for a minute. I think that's still very relevant in a lot of religions today. So,
in some religions, a traditional marriage allows for more than one wife. So depends on the context. Do you think that's because Australia is largely influenced by a Christian sort of background? 100%. And again, I'm not here to discredit Christian religion, or I'm not here to, say what's right or what's wrong. But people just need to really take a long, hard look at what parts of religion are they quoting because it works to their advantage, or what part are we omitting because it works to their advantage. And both sides could find reasons and arguments to justify both points of view.
That's a good point. So I think their main concern is that the LGBTQI people will want to get married in their churches.
Yeah. So again, look, that's an interesting question. Like I've asked myself that question. So, I do go to church occasionally. But I tend to sit in a church quietly on my own. I don't feel that I need a man or a woman in a dress to be my
They let women speak these days.
Right, there you go, right? Yeah. I was like, what's happening in that arena these days? I don't feel I need a man on a pulpit to tell me that I'm closer connected to God. So do I find churches as a place of worship, of a place of spirituality, of a place of holiness and peace? 100%. For me personally, if I was to want to be a church goer, I would want to find a church that, should I want to be married in that church, that would embrace that and would accept that. I wouldn't want to go to a church that didn't. Why would I put myself in that difficult situation? And I mean, we saw just recently a church in Australia that had a straight couple that were going to get married in that church after going to that church for 20 years or however long it was. And because they had a voice and were voting yes, the priest said that he was no longer going to marry them. So they were a straight couple who had an opinion, and he's decided that he's not going to marry them because they're voicing their opinion. Now, I just want to go back to love thy neighbor. Now, one of the fundamentals of Christianity, where is love thy neighbor in that behavior?
That's a really good point. And wow, that must have been a difficult time for that couple that obviously wanted to get married at the church but then couldn't.
Massive. So, they couldn't get married, and this was their place, this was their congregation, this was their spiritual place. But because the one man up there said, well, you can't be supporting same-sex marriage, you can't get married here. So it's ugly, it's messy, it's confusing. I didn't say there was an easy answer to all of this.
Absolutely. And who decides, as I guess we progress as a society, what's acceptable in religion and what's not? I think religion seems to sort of be evolving to some extent, or there's the opposite where it's not evolving at all. Who makes these decisions on, suddenly now it's okay for gay people to get married? According to the church. Is the Pope going to come out and say that one day?
Correct. Who knows? Who knows? And again, how far back do we want to hold on to traditional values? I mean, you do a quick Google search and you'll see some of the quotes, the conflicting quotes that come out of the Bible. If you're not a virgin, you're to be stoned. Moses wrote onto us that if a man's brother dies and leaves his wife behind him and leaves no children, then his brother should take his wife and raise up seed unto his brother. So that's Mark chapter 12, verse 9. So in other words, if your brother dies, you can go and screw his wife.
You've got permission. It's written permission.
It's written permissions. But we pick and choose based on individual agendas.
Look, when it comes to the Bible, it's a book and it's a storybook. So there's a lot of stories in there, isn't there?
Yeah, and again, it's I'm not here to Bible bash. I'm not here to
do the opposite of Bible bashing.
Yeah, do the opposite of Bible
bash.
I just want people to think a little bit more about what they're saying and what they're actually doing. Even growing up as a kid, I grew up as a Catholic boy. I went to Catholic school, and I'm pretty sure, I hope things have changed now. Well, sometimes not really. But I grew up with a terrifying God, a punishing God, and I innately knew that there was something different inside of me, and I felt a deep sense of shame around that. Like, so much so that I wanted to kill myself many, many times. Wow. So much so that I felt less than human, so much so that I felt that I was going to hell. And if there is a God there, I don't think that God wants people to feel like that. I think God wants to feel enriched and alive and living their best versions of themselves, not a shameful, hollow existence that I'm less than or I'm demonic.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much for sharing that with me. I know it must have been difficult. I cannot imagine what you were going through at the time, obviously. But it just goes to show that, a lot of people should think about the outcomes of what they're saying and, just think a little bit before they press their religious agenda on other people.
Correct. And also at the same time, on my side, if you want to call it a side, we need to respect and value that some people aren't going to see things in the same way, and some people want to hold on to their values, and some people want to hold on to what's important to them. And I'd like to think that the world is still big enough that people can go to church if they want to go to church, and we can go and get married and find the churches that will embrace us and accept us and do our best to live harmoniously together.
Absolutely. And a good point to remember is that religious ceremonies actually aren't going to change if gay marriage is passed in Australia. So you're completely entitled to have your religious ceremony. And you gave a great example where, religious leaders can actually choose who they marry as well. So I am shocked about that story, but in a way, I think people are entitled to choose if they want to marry certain people, or if they don't, they're completely entitled to that decision. And if they want to say no to people, they've got the right to.
Yeah, because now what you're doing is, you have these no people that are saying that our freedom of speech will be taken away, but yet at the same time, they're taking away somebody else's freedom of speech in being willing to vote yes. And if they just can't see that, that's what really bugs me. I at least can see when I'm taking away someone's freedom of speech.
What do you think about the idea of, it being legalised in a way, gay marriage being legalised, but not classified as marriage as such, having it be a same-sex union rather, where you still get all the rights that a married couple would have, but for religious purposes and to keep that side of the fence happy, you're not actually calling it a marriage, you're calling it a same-sex union.
Yeah. Look, I love this question, and I've kind of given this question a little bit of thought because it is a very interesting question. It's like, you have same-sex unions. Why isn't that enough? Like, that should be enough. Like, if you think about that statement in itself, there's a lot that's wrong in that statement. What it's basically saying is, look, we'll just give you enough just for you to be okay with the same-sex union. It'd be no different to me saying, look, Christina, you can have a voice, but you can only have a voice Monday to Friday. Come Saturday and Sunday, you can't have a voice. And, when it comes to election time, we'll allow you to vote only every second election time. So just be happy with that. So, yeah.
But I don't understand how I would only have a voice on certain days if I've got identical rights to, putting it in a perspective, just saying like married couples. If same-sex union has all the same rights, nothing different, then what's the problem?
Now, my belief is, and I'm not, again, 100% sure on the exact legal binding of this. Actually, I could probably find it for you. My belief is that it is not exactly the same legal binding as a marriage certificate. So a same-sex union, if push comes to shove, in a legal perspective, does not have the same legal standing as a marriage certificate. So you may have a same-sex couple that have built a life together for 20, 30 years. They've accumulated assets, they've accumulated property, and the parents, because of their religious beliefs, have never approved of that union. One of the partners suddenly dies, and if they wanted to, the parent could come along and they could basically push that person out because they're not married according to law. So to say that a same-sex union is the same as a marriage is actually not correct. It might.
Yes,
it
I
might
understand that completely, and I tend to agree absolutely that obviously same-sex union doesn't have the same amount of rights as marriage. But let's say hypothetically we passed a law that said we're not going to call it marriage, but we're going to call it something else, and it does have all the same rights as married people. Would you be happy with that?
Look, again, my answer would be potentially no, because who are you to dictate that I can't get married? At the end of the day, if you can dictate on a piece of paper in 2004 and by the strike of a hand decide and change that a union is now between a man and a woman, who are you to make that law? I want marriage as an...
It would be upsetting to you, the fact that it's just got a different name and people aren't calling it marriage per se.
Yeah, I would actually, on a moral, out of an equality human rights perspective.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, that's a great answer, and something important for people to think about.
From a human rights point of view, it's my right, should I want to be married in this land as per the law of this land, because I live here, I pay my taxes here, I do everything else, so therefore I should have equal standing as every other person in this country does.
Absolutely. And you made a really good point before about, women's rights and even Indigenous people in Australia. So I believe that, radical segregation obviously used to be traditional too in that sense, and it wasn't until 1967 that there was a referendum that Indigenous Australians were finally included in the population census.
Correct.
So I think that's a good point to remember.
Yeah, based on, a majority, based on somebody trying to dictate how I should live my life.
Absolutely. So business owners will be forced to serve the LGBTQI community if same-sex marriage is passed. Do you think a business owner, like for example, a cake owner of a cake store, should be able to refuse serving any members of the LGBTQI community?
I'm loving the questions that you're throwing at me. You're going for it, aren't you, Christina?
Going for the throat. You're getting fired up.
Yeah, I am. But I love the questions because they're not always black and white. And I think we saw, the classic case of that happening in the US, where we had somebody applying for a marriage certificate and the person working to hand out the marriage certificates based on their personal beliefs, didn't want to give them the marriage certificate. And yes, we've also had examples of where people, businesses not wanting to serve the LGBTQI community. I think I got it right that time. Two sides of the equation. So I try to picture myself. So here I am, I walk into a cake store and I say to somebody, well, I'd like a cake and I'd like a cake for my gay wedding. And that person says, no, we don't do cakes here for gay weddings. Immediately in my head, I'm just thinking, this is what it must be have been like for a black person to walk into a restaurant and say, we don't serve black people here because of my sexual orientation. Well, actually, it's the law, so you now need to serve me that cake because it's the law. At the end of the day, we've taken a plebiscite, we've put it to the people because that's what the people wanted. We've put it to a democracy vote. It's now the law. You must abide the law. End of story.
So you think they should be forced to serve somebody they don't want to serve?
Christina, if it's the law, it's the law. I don't like driving at 60 kilometres an hour on the road because I have a bit of a lead foot, but I have to follow the law. And if I don't want to bake cakes for LGBTQI people, then unfortunately, if the law has been passed, maybe I should consider doing something different. If that's my personal moral belief system, then maybe I should do something different.
Wow. So you've got a very strong view on that, obviously. I tend to disagree with you. I'm not a lawyer by any means, so I don't know if by law you're going to have to, abide by that and serve people if you don't want to. But I think as a business owner, you should have the choice who your customers are.
True.
And I think that almost makes your business better in a way because you can really do the right job for the people that are your target market.
True.
You're not going to waste your time with people who aren't going to appreciate the work that you're doing. And if you've got the right customers, I think that's going to make your business more successful. So even if it comes down to, well, it would be discrimination, absolutely, refusing to serve people on that basis. I think as a business owner, you're totally entitled to your opinion, and if you don't want to serve those people, you've got the right to do that.
Great. So again, I hear what you're saying, and I actually really love this question because it's not a clear thing unless it's passed as law. Then the law is a law because you said it yourself. You have an opinion as opposed to who you should or you shouldn't serve within your business. And I agree with everything that you said, but law will outweigh opinion. So it would be, again, if I'm just going to use the context, it would be, again, no different to me walking down the street and going, well, see that business over there? They don't like to serve black people. They're discriminatory against black people. In that moment, I have a choice. Do I walk past and ignore that? And in ignoring it, I've been implicit in allowing for discrimination to occur? Or do I have an opinion about it and say, well, that's discrimination and call it for what it is? So you are absolutely entitled to your opinion, but there will be, as always, consequences and benefits to that opinion. And in this case, if it's passed as a law, you'll be considered discriminatory.
That's a good point. Now, I just want to talk to you about something. It's a lot more lighthearted, and I don't want to say this and have you take it as, I'm not taking the whole gay marriage thing seriously. But looking at businesses and them refusing certain types of people, would you believe it or not, I was actually refused service by many cake shop owners when trying to find a wedding cake for my own wedding.
Right, and how did that make you feel? Why, first, Christina? I mean,
I'll
why?
tell you why. Because they wouldn't do a gluten-free cake.
Right,
That's why.
okay, great. So
is that discrimination against people who have autoimmune disease and who need to have a gluten-free cake?
Okay, so they wouldn't do a gluten-free cake, right?
They refused to. I was shocked.
Right.
I'm like, I'm giving you my money to make me a wedding cake and you're refusing to do it.
Now,
this is crazy. Like, how hard is it to go to the shops, buy the right ingredients and just do it?
Right.
It was almost impossible to find a place that would do my wedding cake.
All right, so how did it make you feel?
I was very frustrated.
Right.
But then I had to sort of think, well, if they're saying they're not going to do it, maybe that's a good thing because I don't want to get food poisoning and be sick. And if they can't do the correct job, I'd rather find a place that does specialise in that and is going to do the right job.
Of course.
So although I was obviously frustrated and upset, I sort of thought about it and I was grateful that they actually said, no, we're not going to do this. We can't do it.
Great.
And it wasn't, no, sorry, I can't do it. It was, no, we don't do that.
Great. So, Christina, firstly, I appreciate that we're not trivialising gay marriage to gluten cake. So, thank you for bringing that up front. But you did mention that it felt frustrated and you found it annoying, and maybe to you gluten-free is a deep personal issue for you. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. The difference potentially, though, again, it comes back down to, and not that it is it a law or is it not a law? So if that cake just chooses not to do gluten-free, then that's totally fine. It's not against the law to do that. It's a question of, is it the law or is it no longer the law?
I think it comes down to, as a business owner, what the law is and what you're going to be entitled or not entitled to do.
Correct. And look, and it's a tricky question because then I also would go, well, look, that they don't really like serving gay and lesbians, transgender, whatever it might be. Let me just go somewhere else. Like that would be the easy solution to all of this at the end of the day. However, some people want to dig their heels in, like I was saying earlier, and go, but they're discriminating. Do we just ignore that they're discriminating? Just like when somebody makes a racist joke, do we just let that racist joke go by because it makes us feel uncomfortable?
Well, where do you draw the line with what people can and can't do? Do we want to live in a society where we've got no choice and no freedom and we can't choose, what we say online anymore? Yeah. We can't have our opinion.
Yeah, look, and I 100% agree with that. That statement you just said, because I thought the same thing, like, where is this eventually going to go? But again, I'm just going to bring it back to, what's the question that we're really debating at this point in time? Yes or no marriage. It's not about should we be baking a cake for them or not be baking a cake for them. Let's decide that down the road.
Okay, that's a really good point. So the issue at hand is obviously gay marriage.
That's it. It's not.
And
it's not.
I think an important thing to remember is the rights surrounding that.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think everyone should be entitled to equal rights.
Great. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
There we go. So this is a last question, and I laugh when people say this, but I sort of think, like, what the hell? People saying, what's next? People want to marry animals. What are your thoughts on this? It is quite insulting as a statement as well, especially considering, we're talking about, animals and comparing them to people, which is just so wrong. But what are your thoughts on anyone who might have that opinion?
Yeah, look, again, for me, I feel like we're clutching at straws when we're looking at this. We're trying to, once again, move from the issue at hand. And, I've just got to, I don't even know if I can quite put into words how I feel about that question, because the only way I can think I can answer this is, just the other morning I was watching on BBC, the morning show, where they had a man who was on that morning show who had an artificial intelligence sex doll. And this sex doll had two modes. It had family mode and then it had sex doll mode. And this man, that's right. And so this man has his sex doll at home. It sits in the living room and...
Oh, my God. Could you imagine if he had family over and he accidentally pressed the wrong mode?
Right, exactly. And, we've got this sex doll in the living room and he saw it as completely okay, completely fine. He's married. His wife saw it as completely okay and completely fine. So I think, rather than making really silly blanket statements like, what's next? Are we marrying animals? I really hate to say it, I'm just going to call it for what it is, but maybe heterosexuals should really take a look at themselves and where they're going with their definition of marriage and what they're doing, rather than trying to debunk two people that ultimately want to get married because they love each other. So it's just such a ludicrous, preposterous statement to make. Like, again, it's moving away from the question, which is, should a man and should people of same-sex marriage be able to marry? If we want to have a plebiscite about a man and woman or whatever marrying animals, if that's what democracy is about, then have the plebiscite about that at that particular point in time, and I'm sure we'll get the answer that we're all looking for.
I tend to agree. It's a completely separate issue. But on that note, myself and George actually know somebody, a friend of ours, a male who is a heterosexual that married his dog at the Fringe a couple of years ago in public. Right. So there you go, that point that you made about what are heterosexuals doing. Right. I thought that was obviously the first thing that came to mind was bestiality.
Right, of course.
And I was like, that's a bit strange, but... Yeah. I think he was just doing it as a statement to say, you know, I love my dog so much. I don't think it was anything like bestiality or that came into the whole thing. It was just he wanted to do a public show of appreciation for his pet dog.
Yeah, so
there you go.
Yeah, I mean, so the question is null and void. It's already happening anyway. It's actually already happening within the straight community, as you've already just pointed out to us. And I think, unfortunately, what really that question, if you look at the underlying tone from that, is that that's trying to smear the LGBTQI community and associate us with bestiality. And let me assure you, I mean, I don't even like talking about the topic. You could look at any porn site about bestiality and it wouldn't be about homosexuals. There's the broad spectrum of unhealthy relationships in a multitude of different places. It's just such a ludicrous question to be even asking, in my opinion.
I tend to agree, and it's got nothing to do with the real issue, which is we're talking about gay marriage here. So that's a great point.
Yeah.
Yeah. So overall, it's an equality issue, and I think people need to remember that. Yeah. Don't get caught up with, you know, all these other crazy things. Just look a little deeper and realise what's really being asked here.
Yeah, thank you, Christina. I really appreciate that. And I think that's for me why, because I've even asked myself, like, why have I become impassioned about this? Because I may or may not get married. I have no real opinion about that from a personal standpoint at this point in time, but I'd like to know that if I want to, the option is there for me. And I think more importantly for me, it's a human rights issue. It's an issue that I don't want to feel like a second-class citizen within this country because I was born this way. And contrary to what many other people will tell you, yes, I was born this way. I haven't chosen this lifestyle. And I'll be really honest with you, there's been many times in my life where I've wished that I wasn't born this way because I don't fit into the idea of normal and that I have to have my human spirit and my right questioned and challenged by somebody who feels somewhat superior to me.
Yeah. Well, I'm so sorry that, you know, you obviously feel that way. And I guess we're going to have to stay tuned and see what happens with the whole outcome of the thing because, you know, I guess I could say I didn't really care one way or another, but the fact that it's been brought up as an issue now and I've had to vote, I do care now, and I've looked into what it actually means, and it's equality at the end of the day.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, like, you know, I've even asked myself, so how will I feel on that day when the newspapers either put a yes or a no on the front of that newspaper? The truth is, if it's a yes vote, everybody's life who is unaffected by the yes vote, which is all heterosexuals who are currently married or thinking about getting married, for the most part, their lives will continue in the same way. But for many people who I currently know who also have family units, who are already in long-term loving relationships, this will give them a much deeper sense of personal pride, personal recognition, and affiliation with a country that we have come to love very much and feeling equal within that country. So everyone's life isn't going to be affected that's straight anyway.
Yeah, that's a great point. Well, I'm going to have to wrap it up now, Johnny. We've been talking for a while now, and we've certainly really dug deep on some important issues at hand, which is great. So thank you so much for coming on the podcast today and talking about these issues, because a lot of people wouldn't have the confidence to do that or the courage, and it does take a lot of courage to obviously come on and have your opinion and put it out there.
Well, thank you, Christina. It's been an absolute pleasure to be here with you and to have a really healthy debate and discussion about things and be okay with not having all the answers as well. So I really appreciate you reaching out and, getting something out there for your listeners to, at the very least, just think about what they're saying and think about where we're heading with this whole thing.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for joining us. And I do just want to say a quick mention about your business. So you have an underwear company, which is Stonemen, and our listeners can go to stonemen.com and use the code TheUglyTruth to get 10% off your underwear. So thank you so much for that. That's your little gift to us. So thank you.
Thanks, Christina. And we serve heterosexual people as well.
You're not refusing service for gluten-free people. Am I allowed?
No, you're definitely allowed. And also, of course, people can get me on Facebook, Johnnie Cass, if they want to take the discussion any further. And I also do speak around the world as well on human behaviour and performance. So hopefully I'll come across somebody somewhere in this wonderful world of ours.
Beautiful. Well, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today. And goodbye for now.
Thanks, Christina.
For everyone listening, thank you once again. Stay well and see you next episode.
For awesome info and trending content, go to theuglytruth.blog.